Rapunzel grew into the most beautiful child under the sun. When she was 12 years old, the enchantress shut her into a tower which lay in a forest, and had neither stairs nor door, but quite at the top was a little window. When the enchantress wanted to go in, she placed herself beneath it and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me."
There's also another myth where women are subjected to a lot of violence, and as a result, they turn against their oppressors. In one of the stories, I think there's this woman who suffered so much that she just climbed up on a palm tree, again from the tree, the nature. So she climbs on top of the tree, and then she makes a home for herself on top of the palm tree, which sounds impossible to do. But I mean, that's that's her way of revolting against the oppressors, is to turn into this. And then once you're up on the palm tree, then it's easier for people to associate you with being a witch or being a monster.
Really?
I mean, so that's the idea. All of the monsters and the witches, they're usually secluded up on where they can see things. Up on a mountain or up on a tree.
Yeah, well, the palm tree is certainly nice and tall. Yes, so it's quite.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I quite like that idea though. Go up to the top of the palm tree.
Yeah, and I think that's also just always a common theme, is because again the monster cannot live among the village or the victims, so they have to go somewhere where they're safe. But then they can also sort of make the attack. Usually, also the witches are oppressed, so they'll go up somewhere where they're safe away from people. And so going back to that whole thing, monsters are usually in the female gender, and that's either way of making sort of women in the picture of a monster, but also to sort of signal how women sometimes, revolt against their oppressors by turning into these monsters because of the suffering.
So beware.
There you go. Beware of, oppressing the women.
Yes. You don't do that.
Lesson learned.
And which figures? Yeah, there's that.
Rapunzel had magnificent long hair, fine as spun gold, and when she heard the voice of the enchantress, she unfastened her braided tresses, wound them round one of the hooks of the window above, and then the hair fell 20 ells down, and the enchantress climbed up by it.
And it was quite a matriarchal society, wasn't it? Just hopping very quickly over to what you were writing about in the Sand Roses.
Yeah, actually, in Algeria, not all communities, of course, Algiers, where I live, is not a matriarchal society at all. But some of the communities, especially in the south, and traditionally, in some of the nomadic tribes, they tend to be matriarchal societies. Especially, where in Sand Roses we have these red nail dancers, and usually it's the women who go to town, and they learn the financial skills and the urban kind of knowledge, and so they become street savvy in a way. And so they end up sort of managing a lot of the fashion situation for them, but also for the daughters if they become dancers. And then you have the men, traditionally they're cattle breeders, and then they're farmers, and so these are tribes who travel around the country depending on the season. And so they end up performing a lot, or so they go to big cities where they perform, outside of the summer season. So yeah, and so those communities tend to be matriarchal societies where, with women have, and characteristic to traditional customs, they would have a lot of power. I think a lot of it is due to their financial independence as well.
After a year or two, it came to pass that the king's son rode through the forest and passed by the tower. Then he heard a song, which was so charming that he stood still and listened. This was Rapunzel, who in her solitude passed her time in letting her sweet voice resound. The king's son wanted to climb up to her and looked for the door of the tower, but none was to be found. He rode home, but the singing had so deeply touched his heart that every day he went out into the forest and listened to it.
Think of the trees again in connection with the witches. Now that's something I associate with ghost stories, stories of witches in Western literature. It suddenly reminded me there is this association of witches hiding in trees. They turn into rabbits or birds or owls, creatures of the night, and then they will hop into a tree.
Yeah,
There's
and I think with magic, there's this whole basic notion that magic draws their power from the basic natural elements. It could be earth, wind, fire, but also I think trees and animals. A lot of witches have those familiars as animals. So I think there is this strong connection, and I think tree is a strong embodiment of sort of like of nature, and also especially the old power of nature, right? So like if you have this huge humongous tree, probably hundreds of years old, with these large trunks, I think it's sort of almost an intimidating reminder of the power of nature, but also how ancient it is. And so like it's a form of us to connect with the earth and to draw power from it. I think that's where there's a connection always between witches, because there's the magic that's drawn out of nature.
In that year, the district in which the hall is situated was the scene of a number of witch trials. It will be long, I think, before we arrive at a just estimate of the amount of solid reason, if there was any, which lay at the root of the universal fear of witches in old times. Whether the persons accused of this offence really did imagine that they were possessed of an unusual power of any kind, or whether they had the will at least, if not the power, of doing mischief to their neighbours, or whether all the confessions, of which there are so many, were extorted by the mere cruelty of the witch-finders, these are questions which are not, I fancy, yet solved. From The Ash Tree by M.R. James. Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General during the reign of James I, was based in Manningtree, Essex. He was the owner of an inn called the Thorn, where he held his first investigation of a suspected witch. It grew habit-forming, and during a career, if it can be called that, of only 3 years, he was responsible for the deaths of 300 women. In nearby Missley stands an old oak tree. It has been there a long time, since the Middle Ages at least, and so boasts an age of 800 years or so. It has witnessed a considerable amount of history, and is called Old Knobley. Its wide-spreading branches are capable of accommodating a number of people, and indeed it has been suggested that women being persecuted for witchcraft may have hidden here, rather as Charles II with the Royal Oak a couple of generations later. Trees and witches have a long, meshed, entangled history, so entangled that it is hard to tell which came first. Certainly witches might hide in them or might be buried in them. It's details like these that have passed down through generations of storytellers, popping up here and there. A fine example of which is perhaps M.R. James's The Ash Tree. And the present narrative gives me pause. I cannot altogether sweep it away as mere invention. The reader must judge for himself. Castringham contributed a victim to the altered affair. Mrs. Mothersole was her name, and she differed from the ordinary run of village witches only in being rather better off and in a more influential position. Efforts were made to save her by several reputable farmers of the parish. They did their best to testify to her character, and showed considerable anxiety as to the verdict of the jury. But what seems to have been fatal to the woman was the evidence of the then proprietor of Castringham Hall, Sir Matthew Fell. He deposed to have watched her on 3 different occasions from his window at the full of the moon, gathering sprigs from the ash tree near my house. She had climbed into the branches, clad only in her shift, and was cutting off small twigs with a peculiarly curved knife, and as she did so she seemed to be talking to herself. On each occasion Sir Matthew had done his best to capture the woman, but she had always taken alarm at some accidental noise he had made, and all he could see when he got down to the garden was a hare running across the path in the direction of the village. On the 3rd night he had been at pains to follow at his best speed, and had gone straight to Mrs. Mothersole's house, but he had had to wait a quarter of an hour, battering at her door, and then she had come out very cross and apparently very sleepy, as if just out of bed, and he had no good explanation to offer of his visit. Mainly on this evidence, though there was much more of a less striking and unusual kind from other parishioners, Mrs. Mothersole was found guilty and condemned to die. She was hanged a week after the trial, with 5 or 6 more unhappy creatures at Bury St. Edmunds.
They would be seen as witches. They would go and climb on top of the palm tree. They would also lure people into these traps, into a castle.
Yeah, so that it's always like, the trees where you're hidden, but it's also where, your nest is, and so if you have victims, you draw them up there.
It could also be a mountain, or it could be a castle, or...
So it could be a mountain, it could be, I think castles feature a lot in Algerian myths, just because of they're not very familiar. But then you'll be usually like a house on the top of the mountain, or it could be atop of a tree, or like a palm tree. And then so actually in one of the stories, I think the one that I'm trying to think of, I think it's also very reminiscent of what you call that famous fable in the Western culture where there's the lady with the long hair. Is that from Shakespeare anyway?
Rapunzel.
Rapunzel, there you go, Rapunzel. She's not from Shakespeare, is she?
Grimm's fairy tales, I think. It was the brothers from Germany.
There you go. So this one is like, it's very reminiscent of Rapunzel, because also for people to come feed her, they would go up into to go to the palm tree, and then they would ask her to sort of drape her hair so that they can sort of get the food up to her. And then so again we go back to this lady who's super beautiful, who's very pretty, and so it's attractive in her own, but also dangerous, like fatally dangerous, just because of her beauty in a way. And then so in this version, these people are trying to keep her alive, trying to feed her, but also trying to get her back down. And then, she would cry, and then she would say, "No, we can't get her back down," because she's suffered so much for some reason. And so then again, we have like this image where the villagers are trying to get her down, but then there's a lot of oppression. Probably you have to do with something with marriage, but then they're trying all different ways to get her down. So even they're trying to ask her to drape her hair down, that would be a way to sort of to use the hair to drag her back down, if you know what I mean.
Once, when he was thus standing behind a tree, he saw that an enchantress came there, and he heard how she cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Then Rapunzel let down the braids of her hair, and the enchantress climbed up to her. "If that is the ladder by which one mounts, I too will try my fortune," said he, and the next day, when it began to grow dark, he went to the tower and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Immediately the hair fell down, and the king's son climbed up.
Brothers Grimm, they collected the story, but it's originally from France and Italy. I think Italy is perhaps the main original source there. And I'm just wondering, because if it was, depending on how far south in Italy, again, I'm wondering if there's this sort of, there's this whole traffic from Sicily going across to North Africa. It just makes me wonder, is that the connection then? Is it coming from Algeria originally? Is it coming from Italy and spreading across? That's fascinating.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of connection. Again, I think there's a lot of port cities in the north of Algeria. They're very close to Italy, so definitely there is a lot of exchange of these myths between the two places.
The story of Rudabeh appears in the Shahnameh by Firdousi between the 10th and 11th centuries, translated into English by James Atkinson in 1886. Firdousi was the Dante of Persian literature, predating him by at least 100 years, and in the first part of his epic work can be traced a tale that closely resembles Rapunzel in specific details. Like Rapunzel, she is hidden from view, Like Rapunzel, she has long hair, and, like Rapunzel, it is by means of this hair that the prince climbs up to the balcony to reach her. Her name, Rudabeh, screened from public view, her countenance is brilliant as the sun. From head to toe her lovely form is fair as polished ivory. Like the spring her cheek presents a radiant bloom. In stature tall, and over her silvery brightness richly flow dark musky ringlets, clustering to her feet. To you alone the secret of my heart I now unfold. To you alone confess the deep sensations of my captive soul. I love, all day and night of him I think. Alone, I see him in my dreams. You only know my secret and me now, and soothe the sorrows of my bursting heart. There was a beautiful rural retreat in a sequestered situation, the apartments of which were adorned with pictures of great men and ornamented in the most splendid manner. To this favourite place Rudabeh retired, and most magnificently dressed, awaiting the coming of Zal, whom her attendants had previously invited to repair thither as soon as the sun had gone down. The shadows of evening were falling as he approached, and the enamoured princess thus addressed him from her balcony. May happiness attend thee ever, thou, whose lucid features make this gloomy night clear as day, whose perfume scents the breeze, thou who, regardless of fatigue, hast come, on foot too, thus to see me. Hearing a sweet voice, he looked up, and beheld a bright face in the balcony, and he said to the beautiful vision, How often have I hoped that heaven would in some secret place display thy charms to me, and thou hast given my heart the wish of many a day. For now thy gentle voice I hear, and now I see thee. Speak again, speak freely in a willing ear, and every wish thou hast obtain. Not a word was lost upon Rudabeh, and she soon accomplished her object. Her hair was so luxuriant and of such a length that, casting it loose, it flowed down from the balcony, and, after fastening the upper part to a ring, she requested Zal to take hold of the other end and mount up. He ardently kissed the musky tresses, and by them quickly ascended.